today we will explore a thought experiment I've considered for some time on and off, because while admittedly irrelevant, it's just very interesting to consider. What if the Emperor of Mankind had, for practical restrictions, or maybe convinced by ethereal contemporaries, chosen not to create the Astartes, the Space Marines, and so was thereby forced to rely solely on human soldiers in the form of the Imperial Army? Fundamentally, the entire structure of the Great Crusade, the occurrence of the heresy, and the Imperium itself would be radically different. In this exploratory discussion, would anything be allowed, though, in some form of genetic human advancement or augmentation? I think so. The Thunder Warriors were his rushed, necessary warriors designed for unification, powerful but imperfect and dangerous for the long term, but cheap to produce. The Custodes were his perfect creations, but difficult to produce. The Trademarks were a unique pinnacle of the entire project, while the Astartes themselves were the ideal balance between all of the developments. Now, we already know that the Emperor did not complete the Astartes project alone. He had an entire department of people working for him to produce them. And I've often seen people ask why, though, given that he seemingly created the Custodes with considerably less issues than the Astartes, was that necessary? Well, I'll speak to this in the chapter after this introduction. For this speculative scenario, do we allow any of his other superhuman creations? I think so, but then this requires us to reason out why it would be too difficult or otherwise impractical to create the Astartes at scale or over time. So we'll look at that as well, because it's all part of the intrigue in discussing and mentally laying out the thoughts of such a topic. But before moving on, for the purposes of this exploration, I want to say that I will choose to still allow Thunder Warriors, maybe something that evolves even just above them, because in the era of unification, these all but exist already in the form of techno-barbarians during that time. And those forms, unsophisticated as they were enough to be merely tweaked up by the Emperor. And it's very believable that always that would have been the case, even in this scenario where we maybe don't see Astartes. But anything that goes beyond that stage becomes this slow evolution which barely moves forward. The idea of no Astartes is just an appealing concept to think about, because for as epic as they are, they also create a lot of problems for humanity. At the same time, it's very questionable if humanity could have survived without them. And for all of their issues, fundamentally they remain this necessary bulwark between the very worst enemies of the Imperium throughout the galaxy. With that said, there are also interesting scenarios to consider which develop out from the Astartes not having become these unstoppable destroyers that drive forward humanity and the Imperium. Because the Space Marines have always been this sword of Damocles which hangs over all worlds of the Imperium. For any who would rebel against them, even if they can handle the Militarum, even if they can handle the Sororitas, they're always going to face this losing scenario, because even if they are able to withstand the other elements of the Imperium, ultimately when the hammer of the Astartes comes down, you're finished at that point. And that's always going to happen, and that's why so few Imperial worlds are successful in rebelling against them. Anyway, let's just launch into this, and all other adjacent rambles and tangents I want to talk about immediately will come out through the exploration of a galaxy without Astartes. So let's pin this one down first. When I started to first think about this, the most obvious question to go with was, why not Astartes? In the aftermath of the Age of Strife, with what survives of humanity, it always seemed plausible that something approaching the Astartes would be created. If not by the Emperor, then somebody else. It might be heretical to say, but maybe some of the more enlightened and progressive civilizations that had survived of humanity may have over time produced something superior even to the Astartes, but we'll never know that now. The situation after the Age of Strife for humanity was pretty dire. While there were worlds which retained knowledge of genetic manipulation and biomancy, which, remember, out from the Dark Age of technology, we can only assume were extraordinarily advanced, and in terms of creating humans that are effectively a bit bigger and stronger, that seems pretty plausible to be able to achieve. So before we even get to asking why not, we should probably be asking why was it so difficult for the Emperor to create the Astartes at all, especially given that he'd already produced the Custodes and the more crude blunt force Thunder Warriors. So why couldn't the Emperor create the Astartes alone, as I was noting earlier? Well, like so many things, there's no singular answer, but overall it comes down to the issue of scalability in my mind. In an ideal situation, if he'd had centuries to forge an army of Astartes and oversee the development of maybe not every individual, but at a far closer degree than he did, then likely all would have been fine. This, of course, is not how it played out in the era of M30 and M31, and that is because there is always for the Emperor this ambiguous ticking clock. The Emperor is rushing, for whatever reason, to complete his grand project. To a significant degree, it is this, along with just more practical restrictions, which dictates how he is to handle the development of the Astartes, remembering that really he pushes them forward to such a degree they end up being horribly genetically damaged. The Thunder Warriors were able to be readily produced because their numbers were actually relatively small in the big picture of things, plus most of the time they were far from being refined works of genetic adaptation. They were more slapped together with a few modifications with little care if they really survived or not, because ultimately he probably knew they weren't going to survive one way or the other. I think you could liken them to the Nexus 6 replicants of Blade Runner, being that light which burns twice as bright, burning half as long, and so on. So while they thundered through whatever opposed them, some said to be even more powerful than the Astartes which followed, they were unstable and unsuitable for the broader, more nuanced campaigns of the conquest to come. The Custodes were the polar opposite, smaller in number, more of a bodyguard force to protect the Emperor and aid in the development of Terra and the Imperium as an empire. But it's important to remember that the Custodes are not merely adapted humans, they are genetically manipulated from conception, which also does not necessarily need to imply that they necessarily had parents either. There are no restrictions upon the Custodes as there are with the Space Marines in terms of their genetic viability. You won't see Custodes, say, struggling with the adaptation of organ rejection as would many Space Marine aspirants, because remember, ever since the Space Marine project began, it's no guarantee that if you successfully pass the aspirant trials that you actually will make it to becoming a full Astartes. You might get halfway through and your body just struggles and you kind of collapse with many internal organ failures. That is not the case with the Custodes because they are basically refined and worked on from scratch, and so there isn't any of those kind of issues about, inviability or whatever. Also, the Custodes were created in this period where the Emperor was pretty unbothered. He gave them his full attention and knowledge, which was very feasible when you're creating this handful of individuals. I say handful, it's still quite a lot. Nonetheless, this is kind of the point of things, that the Custodes were created in this very bespoke manner. Mass producing them was never going to be viable for what their purposes were and how they were designed. And that still makes them very powerful and a huge asset, but in terms of galactic conquest, at a certain point, sheer numbers do count for something, as many Astartes discovered during the Crusade. The Ultramarines, as much as they didn't really do as much as they could have during the Heresy, were still this terrifying force for many of the traitors who were well aware that if the Ultramarines came in, their vast numbers were going to basically end the entire thing there and then. But in terms of the Crusade, that is why the Astartes were necessary, and at the scale we saw in the size of their legions, not chapters of 1,000, legions of tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of Astartes in that time. And to achieve that is going to require time, infrastructure, and continual oversight for consistency and stability of those capable of carrying out the procedures reliably. In short, the Emperor was not particularly involved in the Astartes project beyond its most early stages. Of course, I'm sure he checked in from time to time, but he wasn't there doing the day-to-day. The Custodes he was able to create pretty much alone, but this wasn't so scalable, whereas the Astartes were, albeit requiring a more complex network of scientists, gene wrights and so on, those capable of competently managing its development. And then you still have the complicating factor of the Primarchs, not to mention the fact that it seems pretty reasonable to assert that the Custodes were created before Chaos and the Warp really started contaminating aspects of what the Emperor was doing, or seemingly anyway. And I should just note that the Custodes, for those unaware, were basically using the Emperor himself, his genetics, as a template. And whilst that is partially true, of course, of the Primarchs and the Astartes, with the Custodes, it is far more fundamental. They were modified in a way to ensure that they were bizarrely both unique individuals capable of far more than just grinding war, that they often referred to as the Emperor's companions even. And admittedly, the Space Marines also exhibited proficiency in a wide range of cultural disciplines, art, etc. But it was the Custodes in this regard who were just on another level. At the same time, they were also disciplined at a genetic level. In short, they were something akin to bio-robots for the Emperor. They were constrained by laws within themselves at this genetic level, akin to Asimov's kind of laws of robotics. Custodes could theoretically not willingly turn against him, as did the Space Marines. And actually you see that in the replicants in Blade Runner 2049 in a deleted scene as well. So it's important that the Custodes are these custom creations, whereas the Astartes were just humans genetically adapted in a manner that retain their individuality, but still leave them at the genetic mercy of being a copy of a copy of a copy in terms of how their genetic adaptability, how the gene seed is being used with them. And that's starting with their Primarch's genetic template, which often in itself had flaws, and then only caused steady degradation in their genetic stability over time, especially because they were pushing so hard to get many more Astartes during the Crusade. Now, had the Primarchs been flawless creations, this may have been less problematic, but very obviously this was not the case, and there are many questions about how they were created, whether there was Chaos influence there, and that was how the Emperor was able to forge them essentially. So I probably went a little bit around the houses there in my explanation, but it's basically why, in my mind, I would still consider Custodes and Thunder Warriors on the table. But the Astartes, well, we could obviously rationalize 1,000 different ways by which they don't come to pass. But I wanted to try, as always, to rationalize with some objective plausibility, the most fairly straightforward reasons as to why they may not have emerged in this time. And this is why I wanted to outline those previous aspects, because we do know that they came very close to not being able to achieve the Astartes project. They reached a point at which they were facing a real block in the project, only eventually able to be overcome by Aemar Astarte, where Belisarius Caul's predecessor had been unable to overcome it. Now, had that not occurred, then it would be this, along with potentially some other elements which could have forced them to dilute, adapt, or just abandon this plan. Because again, for the Emperor, the clock was always ticking. So at some point, if the Astartes development was not working, it's very possible that they would have been forced to conclude, okay, you know what, it's not ideal, but we've got to go with what we've got. And one thought is this. By the time the Primarchs were scattered, he already had Astartes, and thus their gene seed, the availability and stability of which would become an issue much later in M41. But what if it had been an issue right from the start? That in the early period, along with the Primarchs, they also lost the specific genetic sequencing or templates needed for stable gene seed, thus making them unable to efficiently mass produce Astartes. Or perhaps just more fundamentally, we roll back a little earlier and say, in this scenario, the Age of Strife degradation and loss of those with knowledge was even worse, leaving the Emperor only able to practically create unstable Thunder Warriors and bespoke Custodians, was even worse, leaving the Emperor with a pool of those capable with the understanding of being able to do the level of genetic adaptability required for the projects, only able to practically create unstable Thunder Warriors and himself individually bespoke Custodians. And that's pretty much the scenario that I'm going to go with. We know that the scattering of the Primarchs was due to those who opposed the Emperor, but what if something else had taken place that followed, say, in the first few years of the Crusade? The laboratory infrastructure and genetic templates of the Astartes sabotaged, maybe by a splinter of the Mechanicum, thus severely reducing or undermining completely the development of future Astartes. so much so that they become all but inviable, thereby greatly reducing their role and heavily slowing the Crusade. Over time they just get whittled down, so in the big picture of things they only have a limited impact. In such a scenario, I could also imagine something similar, whereby Astartes are created, but what if that scattering had been more devastating, where we see the majority of the Primarchs either never being rediscovered or maybe just destroyed in the process of them attempting to be scattered, or maybe just fundamentally destroyed. This is also a key detail that needs to happen for this speculative imagining, because for us to reach into a world where the Astartes never happened, you really do need to remove the Primarchs as well, because otherwise you'll probably end up somehow retroactively bringing a form of Astartes into being, because if you can kind of create the Primarchs, why can't you do XYZ? Because they're these complicating factors. And maybe we could do another one of these down the line, where maybe only, say, some of the Primarchs survive. How does that situation look? Anyway, for my scenario today, they are just destroyed. Instead of the scattering, they're destroyed in, a psychic shockwave which obliterates them. It's a crushing blow for the Emperor, and it's one which he struggles to recover from because his vision for the Crusade is effectively over before it began. Lastly, I'm going to throw in here what I would deem catastrophic failures or dead-end inviability as additional scenarios which could have reasonably occurred. We're talking situations such as the gene rights, the tech savants, just being unable to produce Astartes with any kind of stable functionality. Because comparatively, the Thunder Warriors were pretty straightforward. They're basically jacked berserkers by most descriptions. Some are a little bit more nuanced, but overall they're pretty much techno-barbarian destroyers, because that's really what they were designed to be. By comparison, the Astartes were at an entirely different level. And yes, some retain the brutality of the Thunder Warriors, but most are completely separated from the raw material that was their predecessors. The Astartes require complex genetic manipulation. They're not just tweaked a little bit to be kind of mad, crazed berserkers. And even, well, apart from maybe the World Eaters, and even when it was successful, there were still many, like we said, who failed to survive the process of becoming an Astartes. And what that reminds us of is one of the key difficulties in enabling this to happen successfully across thousands of individuals. It wasn't a matter of just figuring out the process and the technicalities of how to make an Astartes. It was doing that and then making it applicable so that you could just take basically any human and convert them to an Astartes. And as I say, there's still a rate of attrition in success there. Another scenario could be that while they end up being able to successfully produce Astartes in terms of their physical biology, it tragically also has catastrophic consequences for individuals' own minds, with the product of Astartes conversions just becoming even more savage and uncontrollable than the Thunder Warriors were. So essentially what I'm saying is that those working on the Astartes project, they figured out all the physical elements, but then when they began to implement it, they found that it was just incredibly psychologically damaging for those undergoing the process, and so the entire project just becomes kind of inviable. Another small detail could be that whilst not obviously outright psychers, with the obvious exceptions of the Thousand Sons, we can well imagine that even something like the development of the Astartes is going to require layers of psychic control on behalf of the Emperor, somehow there perhaps in itself therefore causing instability in their development, and again maybe that ties back into whatever happened with the Emperor and Chaos in the kind of proto-development stages. Another thought I had in this pot of ideas was, well, we know that the Emperor, toward the end of the Crusade, wanted and needed to focus ever more exclusively on his Webway project and the throne on Terra. But what if this had needed to be attended to far earlier than it actually did? Maybe he became ever more aware that the vast resources needed to be urgently redirected to this goal, and especially with the struggle in development of the Astartes, he just needed to make that happen as quickly as possible, very aware that things were not going to be as successful as they could have been, and so he needed to kind of cut his losses and just make it happen. So whether it's just a developmental dead end, a sabotage, a loss of genetic templates, or even just some strategic choice to ensure stability of the new Imperium, we can well imagine situations where the Astartes end up being either heavily curtailed or just a flat-out failure in their being developed at all. Which altogether I find just a very interesting thought experiment. Now, I need to throw in a quick additional amendment here, because my brain blanked out on one of the most obvious and plausible means of extinguishing the Astartes project before it even began, that being Basilio Foe. As you know, I rarely add the phrase spoilers because I personally do not really believe that that is a thing in 40k, but I guess for the sake of my sanity, spoilers, because this contains a little from The End and the Death, which is the culmination of the Heresy series, and I guess I would feel a little bad if you didn't want that spoiled, so I guess skip ahead to the next chapter if you didn't. Foe is one of those especially intriguing characters because it demonstrates to us that humanity was in fact highly capable even in the aftermath of the Age of Strife and the Unification era. He was a scientist, but moreover really a biomechanical genius, and had seen the warlords of terror during Unification, including the Emperor, and the many horrors that they all unleashed against one another. Fearing the Emperor's ambition and the clear trajectory to him of the advancement of his transhuman warriors, Foe foresaw the potential destruction of not only terror, but indeed humanity itself. Because should the Emperor lose control, what would happen then? Well, the heresy was what would happen. Foe was one of those able to see the writing on the wall that it was primarily the Emperor's arrogance and impatience that drove him on. He wasn't blinded by the majesty of the Emperor, because ultimately he saw that the Emperor was going to subjugate Terra's population in pursuit of his vision once he had defeated his enemies, no matter how laudable his cause appeared to be or however he rationalized it. To be clear, Foe was no saint, having already been branded a criminal for monstrous creations, but he was able to see the way the wind was blowing because Foe fled Terra to avoid capture. He eventually settled on Velich Tarn, having used his skills to extend his own life, and he ruled there unchallenged. That was the world that would be discovered by Horus's 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, and very obviously, Foe resisted compliance with the Imperium, unbelievably even nearly killing Horus before being defeated and then imprisoned on Terra, which I think highlights the power of some of these ancient figures from the dark age of humanity. Foe, having been returned to Terra, was for him obviously a very souring situation, and it festered and fueled his rage against the Emperor, not to mention deepening his also hatred of Horus and the Primarchs, being locked in confinement, spending years fantasizing about his death. So then during the Siege of Terra, Foe was interrogated by the Custodes Amon, Sindaman and Euphrates Killer. During this, he was offered the prospect to create a virus capable of killing all Space Marines, even the Primarchs. And I think that is a suggestion also to just how out of control things had gotten, that even Malkador the Emperor weren't sure how things were going to go. Now, Foe later would then escape via the assistance of Selenar Priestess Andromeda 17, and while hiding in the palace, Foe attempted to create this bioweapon, but was injured by a confrontation with the Night Lord. He was rescued by Valdor and then returned to Ammon. In one of the best examples, though, of why the Custodes, as I was mentioning, are this near-perfect but also deeply flawed creation, they're able to be manipulated by individuals intelligent and capable enough to really understand what they are. That is to say, to be manipulated by humans of a different age and mentality. So Foe narrowly escapes his own execution by withering away the confidence of Ammon in his own orders, which is just crazy when you consider that Ammon was a member of the first circle of the Custodes in that time. Foe sows these seeds of doubt by just not shutting up and going on and on at Ammon about the legitimacy of his death order, and the Custodes are under such a tight leash from the Emperor that without it being absolutely explicitly clear their instructions that would have been very obvious to anybody basically lesser than a Custodes, he forces them into this moat of doubt using the singular weapon of ambiguity to stay his own execution. Ammon is then later joined by Xanthus and Andromeda 17 on behalf of the Sigillite and convinces Ammon that Foe's work isn't complete, and so proceed to Malkador's laboratory to perfect this virus. Now, why is all of this important? Well, there's more to that story because later we see Foe as one of the founding principal members of radical inquisitorial philosophy. However, while not explicitly stated, Foe's successful anti-Astartes virus could well be the mythical Terminus decree, because very obviously we don't see it deployed during the Siege of Terra. So I think that Foe created this virus and then it's now sealed within the headquarters of the Grey Knights. It's speculation, but it makes a lot of sense, because the Terminus decree is basically the case which says break in case everything goes really, really bad for the Imperium. The Grey Knights also were founded by the Sigillite Order, and so it makes much sense that they could potentially hold that virus designed by Foe. They're probably the only ones trusted to do so as well. So that's a very interesting discussion for another day, but obviously, if that were the case, the implications are just delicious. However, within the context of this video, I think the purpose of what I'm saying here is pretty clear. Foe creates this virus, not at the end of the heresy, but in my speculative scenario at the beginning of the Crusade, and before the scattering can even take place. Thereby, all genetic material for the Astartes project is obliterated. In a rage, the Emperor extinguishes Foe from existence, but nonetheless, the damage is done, they're out of time, they have to proceed. So with all of that in mind, a Crusade from Terra in this scenario ends up looking very different. And considering how this impacts things for such a speculative scenario, we end up making the choices of, do we go with flat out no Astartes development, or just, like I was talking, some minimal levels of Astartes. I thought about this for a good while and settled on going with the nuclear scenario of no Astartes. Because for one, it's the title of the video, and two, it removes weird complications and endless what-if questions where, if you have some, why can't you make more, and so on and so on. Almost inevitably though, some suspension of disbelief is going to be required here, but that's not really hard with just about anything concerning the Emperor. So in our speculative scenario, the Emperor is busy preparing for the coming Crusade. Yet, despite the unification going well and Mars joining the fray, the Astartes project has completely stalled. This is significantly problematic. The reasons as to why this could come to pass, as we've explained, are numerous. Maybe infighting among the gene rights and tech savants, maybe, as we know to be true, there are those who just fundamentally disagree with the Emperor at an ideological or moral level, and maybe that had more impact. Because despite this detail being fully apparent in the lore, it never really amounted to much beyond the scattering of the Primarchs and a few heavy speeches scattered throughout the series. But what if those efforts had been more impactful? A devastating sabotage by those closely working on the project, say, maybe enacted by those unable to resolve those ideological issues, feeling their hand was forced, or perhaps more bluntly, just stability issues they deemed too dangerous to continue with, like I was saying about my speculative psychological damaging concept, and thus leaving the Astartes project basically in tatters. I always think of, and I've used it before, the classic Doctor Who Genesis of the Daleks serial is a decent analogy to compare, because in that we see scientists stuck in a bunker, working on a project that their entire civilization depends upon. The great leader in Davros has created a being with a design that is very fundamentally at odds with those who are working on its own development, and having shifted to being far more problematic than they originally were pitched, now they can fully see the problems that are going to occur, but his power is too heavily entrenched for them to really mount any kind of constructive redesign or resistance against it. So in the end, their efforts are crushed. And that's often the way of the Emperor. If you're not with him, then you're going to be dealt with, or you just end up falling by the wayside. Then of course, in Genesis, the creations turn upon the Creator, which sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Of course, the reason for failure in the Astartes could be more mundane as well. Perhaps just key acceptance of their genetic augmentation couldn't be stabilized, and that leads to just constant rejection. Maybe some elements of them are viable, but the black carapace or other key organs were not able to be fully integrated with such a wide genetic spectrum, and you end up with a tiny elite force, kind of like the Grey Knights instead, which would be very useful, but in the grand scheme of the Great Crusade, it's not going to have so much impact. But no matter were it due to proactive sabotage or just a dead end in genetic development for the Astartes project, It seems, as we've said, plausible that they're still able to produce something approaching the Thunder Warriors. The knowledge required to do so would certainly have been possible even pre-unification. It just requires the will and focus of the Emperor to produce them in coordinated numbers. But they still can't be produced at that scale nor genetic reliability of the Astartes legions as we see in existing lore. So maybe what you end up with are either an elite strike force of slightly polished Thunder Warriors, or they take on the role of supreme commanders of the Imperial army who lead from the front as these behemoth examples of human power. Either way, it's significantly lacking compared to what the Astartes could do. And the final corner piece to the puzzle in this scenario here, as I said, the Primarchs are destroyed before even being scattered. And so, with time against him, the Emperor and Malcador are forced to make the unthinkable, unexpected decision of having to rely upon the forces of the Mechanicum, Solar Auxiliary, and Imperial Army to conduct the Crusade, bolstered by remnants of the best Thunder Warriors who have been augmented and polished to make them somewhat tolerable in the Crusade setting. Some of their kind will be produced here in dribs and drabs and shipped out from Terra, but it's a pale imitation of what should have been. The complete absence of the Astartes, with something not foreseen by the Emperor, and thus leaves them in an extremely precarious and dangerous position. With no Astartes legions, the Crusade begins, but at a much slower pace of conquest. The Emperor accompanies his Imperial army, led at the forefront by the Solar Auxiliary. In the early stages, to bolster their strength, morale, and impact, he ensures they maintain momentum in securing new systems for the Imperium by his own physical presence. But even so, it is highly evident that they lack the physical resilience and immense shock tactics that would have been used by the Astartes. Invasions of all but the most placid worlds are often costly, some drag on for decades rather than months or years. While there are worlds which welcome reconnection with the broader human civilization, and in seeing their compliance they pass easily into the Imperium, there are also entire systems which resist. The conflicts which occur are stagnating and bloody. Many become almost more trouble than they're worth. So much so that in some instances evaluations of required forces to subdue a world or system are deemed to just be counterproductive, and so they're permanently cordoned off and sequestered. In the far future, when the Imperium is more stable, they reason that they can return en masse to crush the holdouts and scour the world for all it's worth. The Mechanicum already played an essential part in the Crusade, with some worlds falling merely at the sight of oncoming god machines, which, let's be honest, is pretty fair enough. But their role now is amplified to a much more significant degree than they would have been were the Astartes present. Their Titan Legios are absolutely essential in destroying key infrastructure of resisting worlds, and their awe-inspiring scale is the main leverage that forces worlds to crumble to the will of the Emperor. And this gives the Mechanicum far more weight to their requests and access to the Emperor than they would have during a crusade of Astartes, and it causes the Mechanicum to gain even greater unfettered access to new worlds, to which they scour ruthlessly for STC technology and the raw materials required for their forge worlds. Custodians are used as diplomatic and physically inspirational linchpins dropped within specific systems to oversee and ensure stability in a bureaucratic chain which binds the expanding Imperium together. To many worlds, they are still the physical embodiment of the Emperor, and their presence is very much necessary to prevent the immediate collapse of worlds and systems which are now part of the Imperium. Overall, though, progress is slow. The push for time is always keenly felt, but despite all their best efforts, they're only able to achieve something in the ballpark of 30% compared to what the Astartes Crusade achieved before the Emperor eventually was forced to fall back to Terra. This significantly diminished pace gives isolated factions of humanity such as the Auretian technocracy time to develop and create empires of their own. Huge territorial areas with ideologies, even some proto-Astartes equivalents in some cases, because as we know, that STC technology held at least in some part the development of the Astartes in their power armor. The Emperor's Crusade eventually begins to disintegrate. The Imperium, such as it is, comes into contact or human borders which are unassailable even with the power of the Mechanicum alongside them. With the Emperor's attentions elsewhere, they're forced to consolidate the borders they have or lose them. In the closing decades of the 31st millennium, the Imperium of Man remains a fledgling overextended empire and is driven not by zealotry or transhuman conquest, but by a cold, rational dream of unity under a singular secular authority. The reach of the Great Crusade has been shallow and incomplete. Vast swaths of the galaxy remain unclaimed, unreachable, or just actively defiant. Among the most significant obstacles to the Terran Imperium's expansion were so-called continuity civs. Now, I base that term off the Aeterna's continuity. That was a civilization which was encountered by the Imperium during its crusade, with its people believing their empire to be far larger and arrogantly refused assimilation. They were not only wrong, they were then crushed into submission by the Imperial fists. But this was not uncommon during the Crusade to see systems and territories who believed themselves to be far stronger and more capable than they actually were. Now, when facing Astartes, that may not have been the case. When facing a world without Astartes, it becomes more plausible that they actually can resist. And incidentally, that world of Aeterna would become later Necromunda, with some saying that remnants of those who first remember that time during the Crusade still exist on the world. I don't think in terms of literally somebody surviving for 10,000 years, but certainly through living memory of relatives and so on. Thus it's believed that there are pockets on Necromunda of those who still hold a bitter grudge against the Imperium to the time in M41. So in our speculative scenario, continuity worlds or civs are just those that I consider capable of resisting or surviving despite, not thanks to, the emergence of the Imperium. These were the human civilizations that had weathered the Age of Strife, with remnants of Dark Age technology intact, and thus including partial or functional STC systems, of which there were in fact more than people often would like to think. But these continuity civilizations were still anomalies in an otherwise broken landscape, because while most human planets regressed into barbarism, techno-feudalism, or just plain ruin during the warp storms and interstellar isolation of the Age of Strife, elsewhere enclaves of humanity preserved self-sustaining infrastructures, advanced medicine, void-capable fleets, some rudimentary forms of synthetic intelligences, and post-scarcity economies. Some were mere single-planet enclaves hidden within warp shadows, whilst others were multi-system governments with automated defense systems, even say something approaching sub-quantum communications, most of which presumably were relics from the Dark Age of technology again. While not uniform in culture or governance, they shared a notably common trait. They had survived without terror and did not seek its rule. I think some of you remember I touched on the edge of this in the past, but it's something I've keenly considered over the years, that many worlds and systems were in fact doing just fine before the Emperor came along, because as I've noted, often the Crusade is told from the perspective of the Imperium, which makes it look like everybody needed to be saved or that it was totally necessary. I question whether that is actually the case. Because many worlds and systems in fact were doing just fine before the Emperor came along. And you might say, well, that's not much to really shout about. Well, surviving the entire Age of Strife with no support whatsoever is a pretty big deal, and it certainly suggests that you've got some ability to defend your own borders. And yes, it is possible that they could be just obliterated in the big picture of things when the Tyranids and the Necron appear, but it's also possible that by then they could have found some alternative solutions, or expanded their empire, or found more technology because they're more open-minded, but were just never given the chance because the Emperor came in and crushed them into submission. But that's often the argument posed by many of the Perpetuals who oppose the Emperor. Many detractors of him argue that humanity's fate should be its own, and that if it falls into oblivion, well, so be it. But it's not their place to force it to happen, which is what the Emperor did, and now it ends up being very questionable if that were the better thing to do or not. Now, when the Crusade reached these civilizations, the Imperium's response was cautious. It was cautious even when they did have the Astartes, but now in my scenario without them, lacking the overwhelming force, they're very wary of destabilizing fragile, overextended front lines. The Crusade of Terror approached most continuity worlds through diplomacy, coercion, or subversion, rather than conquest. The Emperor's vision of a rational, atheistic human unity had no room for independent technological powers, but nonetheless the practical limitations of this Astartes absent crusade were all apparent. Plus the Emperor's ongoing focus on the Webway project necessitated a more nuanced approach. I imagine that some, especially those governed by technocratic councils or synthetic overseers, would agree to nominal compliance with the Imperium in exchange for full autonomy, not dissimilarly to, say, the Mechanicum, which I think is absolutely plausible in this scenario, because most of these civs survive through logical, constructive decisions, not waging war on all they encountered, of course, unless you've got, tons of orc rocks raining down on you. So they would likely pay lip service to Imperial unity, allowing token administratum observers and shared non-critical technologies. In return, they would be largely left alone, their internal systems untouched, their STC cores secure. These worlds were recorded in archives as provisionally compliant, a bureaucratic compromise masking deeper political unease, effectively. Which, personally, I think comically is not entirely dissimilar to how they ended up, even with the Astartes, which sometimes makes you wonder, did they really need to go so hard during the actual Crusade? Anyway, there were others who of course rejected all contact with the Imperium because they viewed its militarized bureaucracy as an archaic and frankly offensive relic, dangerous in its ambitions, fragile in its structure. Some fortified their borders with arcane defense systems that the Mechanicum could barely comprehend. A few engaged in limited skirmishes with exploratory Imperial fleets using, let's say, stealth ships, quasi-AI-led armadas, in some instances maybe absolutely abhorrent biological countermeasures, which were unfortunately likely significantly more effective against the largely human forces of this speculative crusade. Now Terra, witnessing all this from afar, could not afford to dedicate the resources necessary for a protracted campaign of pacification, so again, those highly aggressive territories were very likely to be designated off-limits for the time being. The Mechanicum's role in these interactions continued also to be complex, because unlike in the original timeline, Mars had not yet suffered a traumatic schism. While opinions certainly raged about their role and purpose as part of the Emperor's great vision, it remained unified, powerful, and fiercely devoted to the cult Mechanicus, because the heresy never occurred and there was never that incentive to really break everything apart. But that would be until the appearance of partially functioning STC systems appear outside its dogma and worse, outside its control. Because for the Mechanicum, STC are both a theological and strategic obsession. Martian emissaries often accompany Imperial diplomatic missions offering gifts, treaties, covert espionage, in the hopes of accessing any and all lost knowledge, but most especially STC templates. And this could cause its own problems because, in this scenario, the Mechanicum is far more emboldened than it was with the Imperium originally, and it was already pretty emboldened then. In our scenario, Mechanicum agents might ignite proxy wars, local coups, in their unauthorized attempts to just seize control of such technologies by force or subversion. They're basically out there doing whatever the hell they want. The Emperor had always been forced to tolerate this to a point, knowing that any STC systems beyond Imperial reach were both a threat and a lost opportunity. Plus, it helped him in not riling up the backs of the tech priests. But only to a point. Because without the strength of the Astartes, the Mechanicum continually is just going off script, engaging in their own campaigns with continuity civs where mere rumours of STC technology exist, and in doing so they often waste resources, they conceal their achievements, leading to a slow but steady schism between the Terran Imperium and the Mechanicum of Mars, one that is far more fundamental in its unity than was the schism of the heresy. And so there is a high risk that perhaps not now, but somewhere down the line, the Mechanicum could break with the Imperium, and that would be absolutely devastating. To the new citizens of the Imperium, these continuity civilizations were little more than myth, off-world traders' tales of gleaming cities, disease-free societies, machines that answered without direct input or prayer. To the new administrative officials of the Imperium, they were political thorns, persistent proof that the Imperium was not the only viable future for humanity, something that could be obviously extremely problematic, which again marks a big plus for the Emperor in his Astartes-led campaign, crushing all with momentum before anybody has the opportunity to dig in and resist. And that's why I find these kind of discussions and thought exercises so interesting, because sometimes you are revealing ideas which maybe were not incredibly apparent when you were just looking at it from one side of the coin. Now, I imagine the Crusade by the end of M41 seeing a reality where continuity systems remain a persistent problem. Some may have begun to form quiet networks with each other, exchanging knowledge and technology outside of Imperial view, and that has long been my argument that if they had survived, then such cooperations seem inevitable. And if you fast forward, it's then very possible that if such civilizations were able to persist to M41, then you're going to see alliances with the likes of the Tau and the Eldar, and that's really going to change things up. Elsewhere, others just remain isolated, they're focused on their arrogant individual survival, and I think most often they are the ones who are going to fall over time. They're going to be consumed by internal schisms, predatory external threats like Xenos, even warp incursions. But certainly many endure, watching with cold concern as the Imperium slowly hardens its borders. It becomes stronger out of sight, but certainly not out of mind. The being known as the Emperor of all mankind was surely just a made-up rumour. No being such as this could surely exist. For if he did, an army with him at its head would be unstoppable. In this crusade without demigods and absent of the horror of the Civil War, humanity's future becomes a complex mosaic of divergent paths. We have war-torn sectors clinging to this dream of unification. You've got Mechanicum enclaves seeking forbidden archaeotech at any cost. There are isolated bastions of human brilliance only outshone by their own arrogance. And you have Imperial armies launching spearhead campaigns now with Custodes and ever-refined Thunder Warriors behind them, able to crush individual systems of continuity. All the while, the Emperor still lived, working on his project to open the labyrinth of the webway, his silence growing ever longer. And in doing so, the galaxy turned. The warp stirred, its gods invested now in the long game, but out among the stars, remnants of old humanity still carry the light of hope and the all-too-human resistance to allowing themselves to be dominated by a suffocatingly brutal autocracy. So interestingly, without the Astartes, it's possible the Emperor may have been more successful in some specific projects, but overall this likely finished out as a net negative to his overall ambitions. The absence of the Astartes would have reshaped the Imperium into a slower, more fragile empire. Without genetically engineered demigods, no Horus Heresy, no civil war occurred to shatter the dream of unity that in many ways it would never recover from. With the Emperor still physically alive, he would be able to take some missions outside of Terra now. His power so immense he would be able to crush resistant civilizations, or at least demonstrate his immortal authority to others. For the longest time, in the age of the Crusade, his time was spent just as it was during the original Crusade, hidden deep within Terra or the Webway, pursuing his great work without interruption. Only this time, Magnus did not appear, the warp did not push back or break through. The Emperor remained focused. The Mechanicum stayed unified but problematic in other ways, and the ecclesiarchy never rose to power unchecked in the shadow of the heresy. Lacking any martyr figures or lorgar to fuel the divine origins, the belief in the Emperor was restricted to small cults of worshippers, many of which were extinguished by an equivalent inquisition. Humanity remained rational, fearful of psykers and the warp, and most critically, it remained able to espouse forward-thinking exploration and not descend into stagnant regressive thinking. And in the short term, that works out fine. In the long term, perhaps not so much, and that is a pro and a con. The absence of Astartes also meant the Great Crusade was slow, grinding, and incomplete, forced to be reliant on mortal armies with limited reach and resilience. At the same time, the Imperium lacked its symbolic champions, its strike forces, and in the later period its psychic vanguard. Without the Primarchs, there were no paragons of human potential to inspire unity or dread. The Emperor was powerful and awe-inspiring, but across an entire civilization, his control was more bureaucratic, not so charismatic, and despite all efforts, the warp's corruption still spread quietly through cults and rogue psykers rather than through dramatic betrayals, but at a much higher rate than was seen post-heresy. In this galaxy, the Imperium never fell, but it also never truly rose to glory. It endured brittle and rational, clinging to order in a universe that demanded fire and wrath. Without a rising explosion in unstable psykers, the Emperor remained one of the primary powers of the Astronomicon, and even though psykers still fueled it, his presence and focus were more required. Long wars also erupt across the galaxy, as the Emperor, unwilling to abandon his vision of a unified human species, directs the Imperium's mortal armies against scattered but powerful human civilizations who refuse compliance. But these are not swift crusades of righteous fire, they are slow attritional conflicts waged across decades, sometimes centuries. Many become heavily complicated by wars of ideology, resource, logistics, and stubborn claims to sovereignty. The Emperor's armies of brave but mortal soldiers grind forward ahead of fleets of heavy machinery, Mechanicum-led Titan battalions, but without the speed and terror of Astartes-led shock campaigns, the progress is ever slow and victory uncertain. The instances where the Emperor does show his presence are decisive and crushing, but the galaxy is vast, and he cannot be everywhere at once. Smaller systems capitulate or are ground into submission, but the largest empires remain, and they are enduring problems, not only because of their military scale, but because their very existence challenges the philosophical foundations and implications of imperial unity. In some instances, the Imperium even loses entire systems who just become tired of the imperial rule without the Astartes to then sweep in and crush dissent. We see slow campaigns of assimilation carried out by rival empires who swallow up key imperial installations. Comparatively, many are a model of human survival independent of terror, and where some launch counter-crusades, others employ advanced stealth technology to strike the Imperium far behind its front lines, causing catastrophic disruption and weakness that can then be exploited by others such as Xenos. Elsewhere, they also exploit the bureaucratic nature of the administratum. They undermine elements like trade, powerful figures through blackmail and cultural influence. Over time, the war effort itself becomes a burden. It is resource draining, politically contentious, and morally ambiguous, especially when, for some in the imperial hierarchy, they begin asking whether unity at all costs is really worth bleeding the Imperium dry, and to what end. So far, there still is no overall plan for humanity from the Emperor beyond the imperial truth. Its impact and benefits have been slow to realize anything tangible for the majority of humanity. And so these long wars have a chilling effect on the Imperium's limit for advancement, their morale, and indeed on the spirit of the Emperor himself. Each resistant civilization stands as not just a military threat, but far more problematic than that, a symbol of the dream that humanity may have charted a different path, one not reliant on endless conquest, godlike rule, or sanctioned ignorance. The Emperor, still alive, silent, presses onward. But for every world brought to heel, another slips away, and the dream of unity becomes a mosaic of grudging compliance, enforced silence, and the ever-looming possibility of future rebellion. But in terms of pros and cons, the fundamental question remains. Were the Astartes necessary to merely secure the galaxy quickly and then just burn out? Or had they been envisioned as the long-term defenders for humanity, which we have talked about many times? For myself, it seems fairly clear that they were never designed to be a long-term solution, which then begs the question, were they truly necessary at all? And I think arguably, yes, they were, but it's still possible that the Emperor's plan could come to pass, albeit at a much smaller scale. And the problem therein is that while he could retreat to the webway with his Imperium, other empires would still exist, they would grow, and thereby they would continue to feed chaos, meaning that what many believed was his greater plan to develop a powerful human psychic race while simultaneously starving the gods in the warp could not really function. And so yes, it is a pro that without the heresy, the Emperor remains alive and focused, perhaps even able to complete or partially activate the Webway project to the point at which a human civilization even begins to form within that space, safe from demons, shielded from the warp, and structured according to his cold, rational vision. But then what? Herein lies the core failure, or perhaps the inevitable limitation in this speculative scenario from the perspective of the Imperium. Other human civilizations still exist beyond its reach, and that is a big problem for many reasons. And whether they remain independent, whether they advance spectacularly, whether they decay, the point is that all of them continue to live, to suffer, to hope, rage, die. They're basically feeding off the eternal human condition against one another, and in doing so, they feed the warp. Some inevitably are going to be corrupted in isolation, they're going to fall to chaos completely, others are just going to teeter on the edge, they're going to be destabilized by psychic surges or slow cultic subversions. Similarly to perhaps a pocket version of the Age of Strife, there's going to be Xenos, orcs raging unchecked without Astartes around, Eldar remnants drifting through the void, and of course worse things on the periphery or just in the shadows. The Emperor's core vision was predicated on totality, a unified mankind that was controlled and fundamentally evolved. It was to be guided under his will, protected within the webway, and at this stage the Emperor could have then developed humanity at a very, very fundamental level, using collective, harmonious thought to unmake the horror of the warp over thousands, maybe even millions of years. But this plan only works if all of humanity comes along. So in a fractured Imperium, without the Astartes to force it into submission, unity is just impossible. The Webway Imperium becomes little more than a fortified sanctuary from the billions of other human souls still adrift in the Materium. Chaos doesn't need, it doesn't care to see the Imperium fall, so it makes little effort to that end because mankind is already continuing to exist in pain and ignorance and suffering and all those things. So while the Emperor achieves a partial victory in securing an impressive, substantial post-human refuge, a pocket empire of stable, psychically evolving humanity that lives in balance and harmony, outside remains a galaxy that's just all too human. Chaos is festering. Periodically, its bloated worlds of corruption are going to burst like a pus-filled boil, unleashing a flood of corruption across many sectors. This contamination of the galaxy is going to be slow, insidious, persistent. Independent continuity worlds are slowly consumed. Minor human empires collapse into demon worship or implode under unchecked psychic pressure. Warp storms intensify. The webway may be breached in places. The dark tide presses inward. And something approaching a second Age of Strife may be set to begin there. Less dramatic maybe in its emergence, but no less consequential in how it isolates entire systems and then consumes them. The Emperor is left with this bitter reality. He achieved victory in securing his long-term vision for isolation with the Webway project, but lost the war in the battle for the soul of mankind. Because without the aggression of the Astartes to bring all into his singular vision, all that then remained was a sanctuary amid a poisoned sea, a city with no power to purify the darkening world beyond its own walls. Now please forgive that some of these are effectively summaries because trying to fit 10,000 years into a single chapter of a video is quite the tall order, and again I didn't want this one to be 6 hours long, but here goes. In the vision of this age, the galaxy did not ignite with the flame of rebellion and heresy. Most obviously, first, the Emperor of Mankind survived to remain on the Golden Throne, an ageless, enduring sovereign. He was never wounded by Horus, the Siege of Terror did not occur, the masses did not see the power in faith, nor was he deified by mourning followers. Instead, the Emperor retained full control of his faculties and his great vision. The imperial truth remained the bedrock of the Imperium, secular, rational, and merciless. Faith in gods, including himself, were of course outlawed, crushed beneath reason and unity. Yet the absence of such a dramatic crisis meant the post-Crusade Imperium surprisingly lacked a defining moment of purpose. The dream was never lost, but neither was it made whole. The Emperor was a figure of immense power, to be sure, but still only one individual, and balancing the defense of the entire Imperium against the steadily increasing power of independent, resistant human civilizations was going to be continually problematic. The closest aides of the Emperor, such as Malcador, survived also, yet without open war between Astartes and the Palace, the foundations of the Imperium appeared initially more stable. There appeared a very good chance that although slow, they could retake the galaxy in time. Yet this plausible optimism masked the deeper rot of human nature. Over centuries, the bloated machinery of governance grew unchecked. As had been seen during the initial era of unification, the Emperor did not favour the cold, emotionless rule of law, justice, and human governance. His vision had been focused around crushing all who opposed, but now he found himself having to deal with the mortal scale of things once again. The Administratum, the Mechanicum, planetary governors, many emboldened by their distance from terror and their regional power. Basically, bureaucracy. And on the scale of the Imperium, this began to slip, inevitably, into great corruption. Many worlds became fiefdoms in all but name. And all the while, chaos denied its grand war, changed tactics. Cults spread through the cracks in the bureaucratic edifice, not as armies, but as ideologies. Secret lodges, strange philosophies, hidden rituals crept into administratum branches, planetary senates, and even among the lower ranks of the Mechanicum. Subtle, demonic influences pervaded the very soul of the Imperium, and in many respects even more insidious than the heresy had ever been. At least that was something visible and more directly able to be contested. This festered across thousands of worlds and was considerably more difficult to root out. Cults to Slaanesh took root among highborn nobles seeking sensation beyond mortal understanding. Tzeentchian sects poured out among rogue psychers, failed scholars, power-mad governors. Khorne was worshipped in the gladiatorial arenas and death cults, while Nurgle's children festered in the underhives of forgotten worlds. And all of this was something that the Emperor, Malcador, and the agencies they created were all well aware of. The Inquisition was still founded and ordered to deal with such matters, but they had considerably less resources than in the aftermath of the heresy, so their progress was always slow. Then of course, as the Emperor never became viewed as a martyr and a god, nor was faith in him sanctioned, quiet veneration surely began to stir. Soldiers whispered prayers before battle despite the prohibitions. Starving pilgrims saw visions of a golden giant in their dreams, but it was entirely lacking and largely trivial. Any cults which grew sufficient standing were just immediately suppressed, if not exterminated actively by the Inquisition and Sigillate loyalists. Nonetheless, cults of the Emperor never fully died. Most often they fragmented into thousands of regional sects, many contradictory, some heretical. Ironically, the Emperor's refusal of divinity created a void, and in that void, legends grew. Because of course we know that only the true Messiah would deny their own divinity. By M39, elements of the bureaucracy on Terra had begun to tolerate low-level worship, as the idea of the Emperor being so absent had just become a necessary myth. But this was something barely tolerated still and never really endorsed, so these faiths remained disparate, ungoverned, vulnerable to corruption and schism. In many ways, they often were still counterproductive, reducing the effective resources of the Inquisition, who were forced to deal with these worshipping civilians when really they should have been rooting out true corruption. Then of course, without the Astartes, humanity was left to stand against the Xenos horrors with all too mortal resources, which were costly and far less effective, which again diminished any potential plans tabled by the Emperor and Malcador, who found themselves often in a fluid defensive strategic role more than they did engaging in new regional crusades. Orcs, unchecked by the firestorm of the heresy and the wide distribution of Astartes in the aftermath, now surged in numbers. Wars became an unending reality of life in Imperial space, many so persistent and large that entire subsectors were lost. The ever unpredictable orcs remained a constant threat and were very fertile ground also for Khorne's influence in both orc and human minds. In the early period of M32 and M33, there are far less Necron emerging in this time than will do so in M41, as was true previously. Yet now, without the destabilizing chaos of heresy to mask their rise, the cold, methodical exterminations catch the Imperium's attention much earlier. Consequently, some regions are declared null zones and quarantined, but the threat still grows. Specialist forces of Custodes paired with extermination fleets are tasked to cauterize these alien horrors from Imperial space. Most often, Exterminatus is seen deployed from within a world to cut out the alien cancers within a sector. But as the Necron threat is detected on more and more worlds becoming easily identifiable, it becomes clear that there is a far greater problem here than first appeared, and the Imperium begins to use misdirection instead to redirect its enemies to such worlds or awaken tomb planets toward oncoming Xenos threats like Orc Wars. And this is enough to minimize the damage presented from the Necron. The Eldar also, as ever, are reduced to their craft worlds. Little changes with regard to themselves, as the Eldar already tended to keep distance from humanity. They engage sometimes as allies, more often as enemies, and the Emperor's refusal to acknowledge anything other than the rational meant that human diplomats failed to understand the spiritual core of the ancient species, and thereby miscommunication led to conflict. Elsewhere though, the independent human colony empires engaged with more nuanced diplomacy with Xenos, and this only bolstered their strength, making them more difficult for the Imperium to attack or stand against. And still, of course, in every conflict, chaos watched and fed, more passively than it ever would have with the presence of the Astartes, yet now, even despite the survival of the Emperor, every death, every fear, every moment of hatred and boiling human emotion made the warp stir. The Chaos Gods, in many ways, had already won, and they had done so without the need for victory in open war. As mentioned in the previous chapter, although not completed in its entirety, portions of the Emperor's webway do become functional. Some worlds are connected by these shielded corridors, bypassing the warp entirely, and this brought the Imperium great advantage: safe and faster travel, reduced mutation and corruption. In the core sectors, humanity became effectively shielded from the warp's touch, but this safety also slowed the psychic awakening the Emperor received the strength of while sat upon the throne. With psychers culled, travel sanitized, and the warp kept at arm's length, the species remained stunted, evolution faltered. And all of these factors just roll on across the millennia, and are as much a factor in diminishing the future success of the Imperium as is this ongoing malaise of the Emperor. Yet out on the borders of the Imperium, things are quite different. The frontier sees a bloom of uncontrolled psychers and mutants, and these backwater worlds become breeding grounds for uncontrolled human evolution and warp interaction. The Emperor's influence, though, still begins to fray. In the vacuum left by a slower, more cautious Imperium, other powers begin to emerge now. Among the stars, independent human enclaves, heirs of the dark age of technology, resurface. The options here are very wide-ranging. We can imagine that some may unlock the potential to construct sentient fleets. We could imagine that the wider kin to the ancient leagues of Votan reclaim old domains, unlock secrets, and bolster emerging independent empires. On Forge worlds, long forgotten by Mars, Neo-Mechanicum cults worshipped in their own ways, or even abandoning the doctrine of the cult Mechanicus in defiance to both the Emperor and the Martian priesthood. Some attempt to stand alone, others integrate to strengthen the independent human empires who have already unlocked vast STC wealth. These are the technocracies that resisted imperial reintegration. Their fleets were powerful, their technologies forbidden, their ideologies heretical. The Emperor, increasingly withdrawn, struggled to project authority across such distant systems. Some say he had grown silent in frustration, others believed he still guided from the shadows, unwilling to abandon his original truth, effectively doubling down. But the only real truth is that he still had not ascended nor escaped from his own design. The Emperor, so inflexible, so hyper-focused on the singular path that had come into his sight for so long, could not countenance such a devastating random event that shattered his illusion. The dream of guiding humanity to the ultimate psychic race now seemed distant, even impossible. The Imperium stands, enduring, but without the fire of the envisioned Crusade and heresy, the old and the dead that remained in the aftermath of the Age of Strife were not burned away fully. The wounds of that age never scarred, they only festered. As we reach the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the Imperium of Man stands no longer as a galaxy-spanning colossus, but as a fractured, desperate empire of fading light. The Great Crusade, waged millennia ago without the might of the Astartes or the guidance of the Trademarks, advanced very slowly with the inertia of human frailty and fell well short of its goals. Without the rapid conquests of superhuman legions, the Emperor's dream of unifying all humanity was never fully realized. Countless worlds remain independent, lost, or fallen to Xenos dominion and dark powers. All while the Imperium clings to a swollen, half-connected core of territories that are scattered across the stars, some tethered by fragile warp routes, guarded by mortal armies that are stretched to breaking, which very often they do. In a fragmented galaxy where the Imperium's reach is shallow and the absence of the Astartes keenly felt, it has left vast regions unclaimed. The dream of human unification dies in calculated annihilation. The void has become a Cheops board of powerful technocratic human empires, having survived the Age of Strife with their own fragments of Dark Age technology and STC systems. Eventually they begin to collide. Their shared origins offer no solidarity, only a bitter survival-driven rivalry and competing ideologies. The great wars that occur between them shatter any hope of humanity's reconciliation. The Emperor, now never struck down by Horus, remains a prisoner of his own ambition. Though he survived the ages in his immortal body, he is absent in all but doctrine. Locked deep within the palace vaults beneath terror, he exists in a prison of downfall, directing nothing, presiding over nothing. The Webway project, his ultimate gambit, was successful, but really in the big picture it failed, not through rebellion or technical inability, but through the slow rot of human shortcomings, the bureaucratic entropy, the warp incursions that destabilized entire systems, the creeping corruption of the human spirit, both of the material and immaterial. While officially Terra remains the throne world, it is also bloated and polluted beyond recognition, both physically and in terms of its administration. The Emperor has all but retreated now from reality. His confidence in himself is shattered, his belief in his ability to plan for the true vision of humanity collapsed. The Emperor falls back upon the words of his detractors. Maybe they were right, that humanity is best left to chart its own path forward. The Golden Throne flickers, not as a lighthouse of divine power, but as a relic few understand and none can repair. The Astronomicon is diminished in power. Over the millennia, humanity's rational truth has significantly decreased the availability and presence of psychers. The Emperor is not the figure he was 10,000 years previous, and as such, warp navigation is erratic and limited to short, dangerous jumps, enforced by a dwindling cast of navigational psychers who burn out like the last candles in the void. The Imperial army, once proud and focused on their grand goal as part of the glorious Crusade, have over thousands of years fractured into planetary and sectoral militias. Order is maintained, of course, with brutality, not unity, and lacking Astartes, the Imperium never had a stabilizing elite force to serve as a glorious example, nor as the executioners. The Imperium is now overseen on a day-to-day basis not by the Emperor or Malcador, but by an ever-churning oligarchy of High Lords, each more paranoid, power-mad, or strategically stagnant than the last. The Mechanicum, having never suffered the schism of the Horus Heresy, has grown to become more powerful than ever. It now operates with little to any oversight, if it truly ever had any. Its Forge Worlds jealously guard the secrets of technology and treat the rest of the Imperium as customers or vassals rather than allies. It very much distances itself from the Imperium, using it as a necessity where it must, but otherwise restricting all access to its own planets. It forges forward with its own goals, to which the rest of human civilization can only begin to guess at. Often, in the name of the machine god, entire hive planets are consumed by the raw need for material matter at the most leviathan Forge Worlds. Though no great heresy shattered the Imperium, as was stated to the Emperor by his critical perpetuals, chaos ultimately looked to win regardless. Because as predicted, the warp seeped in through 1,000 lesser wounds. Demonic incursions strike at isolated colonies, cults rise in hive cities as ever, and the Inquisition formed not through crisis but quiet necessity, now waging an endless war of suppression and purgation, but with considerably more limited resources than in the age of the Astartes. As we noted before, in this time no formal religion was ever created for the Imperium, only cults approximating the cult of the Emperor. But these are more about the Emperor himself as just a cold, unreachable god of order and silence. Many factions have wildly differing views, often they conflict with one another. Some worlds in fact are consumed by religion and religious wars. Elsewhere, it's outlawed on pain of death. Overall, what qualifies as faith in this Imperium is little more than a tool for control, not really inspiration or salvation. And its numbers still count in the billions, but that's nothing approaching the reach or unified focus of the ecclesiarchy, and as such its impact upon the spiritual psychic power of the Emperor is entirely negligible. Most notable, of course, are the Xenos empires, which now effectively run unchecked by the stalwart methodology of the Astartes. Without their presence, the Xenos thrive. Orcs with their wars, the Eldar continue to haunt the fringes as these diminished icons of forgotten empires. The emergent Necron scour entire planets and systems. Curiously though, the Tyranids do not arrive into the galaxy. And this was one of the first thoughts when we were discussing is how on earth could the Imperium survive without the Astartes and the Tyranid presence. Now I know it's not definitive, but the destruction of the Pharos device is believed to have attracted the attention of the Tyranids to the galaxy, and so without the heresy and the Astartes, that event never occurred, and so consequently the Tyranids never arrived into the galaxy, or at least not when they did. Now it's not to say that this never could occur, but it's interesting to think that because of the lack of Astartes, what we end up with is a diminished Imperium, a less aggressive chaos, no Tyranids, and Xenos that are, perhaps overall, somewhat more palatable and resistible, with perhaps the exception of the Necron, which are a big problem, but that one is debatable depending on the rate of their spread and intentions. So overall, in this scenario, in M41, the picture of things with regard to the Xenos is actually quite interesting. Then we have the technocracies. These are the human civilizations who rose to ever greater power despite the pressures placed upon them. Across the millennia, many of their number saw vast wars occur that threatened their very existence. They fought with the Imperium, they fought with each other, they fought with the Xenos. A few speculative examples: the Lucent War, which saw two of their empires annihilate one another totally over a lost STC system. They accidentally triggered the reawakening of a planetary-scale autonomous defense system. Elsewhere, perhaps a psi construct of human-AI hybrid intelligence turns the phasing space between reality and the warp into a weapon, able then to infect minds and networks until entire worlds collapse into mimetic ruin. The War of Truth, the Imperium's attempt to support a rational federation against AI-worshipping enclaves, but it ends in their total humiliation as quantum singularities and constructs that can bring down titans as easily as infantry see a scale of warfare unleashed that obliterates entire fleets. The aftermath sees the Imperium lose multiple sectors of space. And then finally, in the segmentum Pacificus, M35, the Obol Cataclysm. This stood as an example to the dangers of AI. The Obol technocracy had long relied on its STC that had self-repaired and consequently begun to steadily provide stronger defences and tech capability to its society. Its borders expanded, its defences impenetrable. It seemed to be unstoppable. Even the Imperium were forced to cede territory to them on numerous occasions. But all of this were to end when the STC finally chose to link itself with the members of its leading human council, to which it was then finally exposed to the dark side of the human psyche: trauma, greed, nightmarish suffering, and desires beyond description. It fractures into madness, unleashing exponential replication and autonomous war machines that slaughter billions. In effect, it's a localized war with the Men of Iron once again. It forces a brutal imperial quarantine, and only the collective efforts of multiple neighbouring technocracies and Xenos are able to destroy the bulk of the machine forces. Finally, the homeworld is destroyed. The singular truth was self-evident. Humanity, divided and ungoverned, was unable to wield its ancient power without courting annihilation. The Emperor's dream, meanwhile, fades continually beneath the cold logic of machines and the chaos of uncontrolled minds. By the 41st millennium, many once thriving technocracies that had endured the age of strife and defied the slow advance of the Imperium burned brightly, but they also fell very hard. Had they instead chosen to unite and challenge terror itself, it's possible things could have turned out very differently. But for as advanced as they were, they lacked the uncompromising will of the Emperor's vision, and were so left to default to the human habits of territorial management, trade, and ultimately fragmented weakness. Their greatest strengths proved to be their undoing time and again. Many collapsed under the weight of their own ambition. History repeated itself, for humanity is nothing if not predictable in repeating its own history. Cities were devoured by sentient war machines, cultures imploded in the wake of psychic outbreaks or failed transhuman projects which saw their subjects rampage and destroy planets, leading to catastrophic implosions of order and control, and then allowing Xenos to sweep in and scour what was left. Others were quite simply just consumed by chaos, unable to fully comprehend the immaterial dangers their rationalist ideologies had easily dismissed, realizing only too late that the psykers they had so long persecuted were in fact the key they should have enabled. Some were of course also crushed by imperial campaigns, the standard slow, bloody wars of attrition waged by the mortal armies, coupled with Malcador's sanctioned assassins, Mechanicum monstrosities, and under the weight of all this, a few did choose submission, trading independence for their survival. But even so, by M41, only a handful of the most powerful technocracies remain, and the Imperium. Those that have survived are now isolationist, secretive, powerful, yet also very diminished. They're no longer sprawling federations or expansionist powers, they're fortress states, buried deep within warp-locked sectors, shielded by their archaic technology and machine spirits older than the Imperium. No longer are they confident in their ability to stand alone. Some have made the unthinkable choice in choosing alliances with the Xenos. The shattered logic of survival has driven certain technocracies to share their data with the Eldar, exchange materials with Tau enclaves. In an age of the Astartes, the Imperium would clearly have viewed these acts as heresy of the highest order. Chapters bolstered by inquisitorial warbands would hunt down rogue tech enclaves, while the Mechanicus would seek out all machine craft as abominable intelligence to be destroyed. Yet here, they do not have the luxury of such powers. The Imperium is overstretched, paranoid, and largely impotent by the nature of its own internal decay. Terror can no longer afford full-scale conflicts on the basis of ideological purging alone. The galaxy is simply too vast to police. The High Lords increasingly turn a blind eye, especially when these technocracies in secret offer crucial technologies or hold the line on shared borders against greater threats. Elsewhere, Imperial territory is traded for wealth. The technocracies cast a dark shadow across the Imperium. Among the endless wars and rising tides of chaos, they stand too defiant to join the Imperium, too scattered to unite, and too dangerous to ignore. Their continued existence is a permanent wound to the Emperor's vision of total dominion, an endlessly painful reminder that his dream was never realized. As the galaxy spirals toward a destructive new age, these last bastions of Dark Age knowledge stand at a crossroads. Retreat further into isolation, corrupt themselves through alien pacts, or to become something entirely new. Neither imperial nor human, but something far stranger, born of cold logic, desperation, and the long memory of stars. A bizarre confederation of human, AI, and Xenos. It's a horror too unimaginable to endure, and sees the Emperor launch his last great crusade. Now at this stage, I feel obligated to simply remind yet again that today is a highly speculative video. It seeks to explore what could occur in a reality without Astartes. I envisioned an ending where in M41, after the Emperor wallowed in a 10,000-year malaise, he finally emerges, enraged, clear-minded for the first time in thousands of years, and sees to his horror the very worst imaginable state of humanity, the final end point. His Imperium is crumbling, and the technocracies have disgraced the fundamental principles of human civilization. In the dying centuries of M41, chaos is rising, the stars are darkening, and after so long finally, Malcador still is present, but he's barely capable of moving nor speaking. He convenes with the Emperor through psychic communion alone. He brings news from beyond the Sol system. A news which ignites within the Emperor a presence of mind he has not felt since the unification. The Emperor launches what will become known as the Final Crusade, a last desperate effort to reassert control over the fractured destiny of mankind. At its heart is a singular target, the Syncretic Mandate, a sprawling, secretive confederation of post-human technocracies, artificial intelligences, and even Xenos factions, all operating in a bizarre, unholy alliance that by all reports seeks nothing less than the extermination of the Imperium and the death of the Emperor. This is the Imperium's heresy, but it comes 10,000 years too late. This technocracy is said to be ruled over by a travesty of a creation, an entity long unknown to most of the Imperium, and has ruled over the technocracy there for thousands of years. It was never the largest, but it gained enough power to resist all who entered its territory. For whatever reason, they had chosen now as the time to break out and destroy multiple adjacent human civilizations and amalgamate others it deemed compatible with their own values. Having amassed enough knowledge from forbidden Xenos learning, STC networks, even warp extrapolation, it began to discern a plan that it calculated would allow them to dominate the galaxy by shaping a hybrid future which defied all Imperial orthodoxy. Malcador's agents brought this intelligence to him, and he delivered it to the Emperor. It was not merely a rival, but an active abomination, a vision of humanity untethered from purpose, balancing far too close to the abyss, so much so that it could unwittingly lead all to total extinction. Of course, with no Astartes to lead the assault, the burden falls to the full weight of the Imperial army, the Titan legions, the Sisters of Silence, the remnants of the Custodians, coordinated and driven by the agents and across the 10,000 years, specially designed forces of the Sigillite. The Emperor emerges from his isolation. He is able to convince the Mechanicum that this is an existential threat. They join the ranks. The Crusade begins. The war is predictably catastrophic in scale and scope. The technocracies that are swept up in the conflagration have never seen a war as brutal and unrestrained. Most of all, they hear of the golden, godlike figure who decimates worlds, long rumoured, never seen. The Imperium is said to be leaving entire systems scoured and burning. No mercy is shown, no prisoners are taken. They have unleashed a war of full extermination. Many attempt to finally bow to the willpower of the Emperor, as they should have from the beginning, but all too late. They're stripped of their assets and hardware. Civilian populations see the crusading fleet leave as the fires of Exterminatus cleanse their worlds for all time. The Crusade spans decades. The death toll reaches into the hundreds of billions. The Syncretic Mandate is taken aback by the sudden ferocity of the war. They had not yet fully established their own plans, and many alliances were still being mediated. Some of those diplomatic arrangements collapse as the agents of the Inquisition sow doubt and confusion among the enemy. Alien logic remains incompatible, and for those too uncertain of how to act, they're cauterized with terrifying efficiency. But the technocracy pushes back hard, with biocomputational fleets, psionic dampening fields, virus weapons, sentient starships, and weaponized AI thought forms. They decimate strongholds of the Imperium. They even launch counter-assaults into Imperial territory behind the Crusade line. Devastating losses are taken, but the Emperor loses no focus from their ultimate goal. Some Forge worlds turn traitor under synthetic influence. Ground wars of tens of millions are without warning wiped out by abhorrent virus weapons. It's a firestorm that sees the culmination of weapons and tactics not unleashed since the Dark Age of technology and the era of unification. The Emperor finally believes they draw closer to the final system, the prime world of the Syncretic Mandate. And here we would see Malcador's last act. In binding his soul to a psychic array at the heart of the Mandate's central nexus, the enemy is finally shattered as the system is detonated. The Emperor himself performs the final act, and as Malcador dies atomized in both body and essence, the shockwave cripples much of the Mandate's AI infrastructure, causing systems to collapse and Xenos allies to scatter. The Emperor unleashes a single battle with the Mandate, and after a grueling war against skittering clone forms, shades, and the worst replication hordes that he has not witnessed since the collapse of the Golden Age, and victory is claimed, but a hollow one. For the Imperium stands bloodied, broken, and exhausted. The forces of the Syncretic Mandate still ravage Imperial territory, and much of the fleet is quickly tasked to relieve and reinforce remaining human territory. In the aftermath, his task complete, the Emperor retreats in silence to the Golden Throne. Perhaps wounded, perhaps withdrawing for reasons none can understand. No new orders come, no proclamations are made. Only the hum of the throne and the endless waiting. The Custodes guard the Eternity Gate, opening it to no one. The High Lords return to their arguments behind closed doors. What to do now? The Mechanicum branch out with plans of their own after securing immense hoarded relics from the fallen Mandate, even as rumours begin to emerge of strange Xenos phenomena at the edges of the galaxy. The Emperor's final crusade had ended, but no one knew what came next. The Imperium endures, not because it is strong, but because it simply is too vast to kill quickly. The dream of unity is gone, the Emperor's original purpose unknown, and all that remains is mere inertia. An empire not of hope, but of raw survival, clawing through the dark one blood-soaked step at a time. The Emperor still ends up as a corpse god, albeit a slightly different variant. He's just trapped within the despair of his own failure, to which I know that some might consider this to either be a bit of a cop-out or a disappointing end, and I'm open to considering this in another version later that is perhaps more optimistic. But I think that when we look at the Emperor's character, he varies between this empathetic desire for humanity's future and raging arrogance that he and he alone can guide humanity's ultimate endpoint. So it's entirely plausible to think that should that effort collapse so completely, his grand ambition basically disintegrating by stalling into stagnation, he could be consumed by his own hubris, left to consider the thousands of conversations he had over his lifetime and wonder were his fellow perpetuals right all along. In M41, there remains to be no peace among the stars, only cold, dying embers of failed human ambition. The Imperium is consigned to entropy. Its only hope, those empires that refused to back down, that still could, potentially, somehow, find a solution to the greatest problems facing humanity. Should, though, they turn and choose to wage war against the Imperium, it stands with little ability to resist, or indeed do much of anything about it. But just maybe, one of those technocracies who has still survived, the most powerful among them, could one day rediscover terror. The Imperium has long since disintegrated as anything recognizable. But in the dark catacombs of a ruined, ghostly palace complex, they discover a silent figure, sitting atop a cold throne of gold, unmoving, in the bowels of a world they do not recognize as the origin of their species. More than a millennia has passed since his friend Malcador made the ultimate sacrifice. The giant of a man stands, to the shock and horror of those who discover him. They thought he was a statue or dead. Instantly, he inspires awe, terror, and intrigue. He considers carefully. He learns about this human tribe. He has had all the time to consider the words of those he once knew across his entire sentient experience of life. He is willing, maybe obligated, to try one last time. With this final effort and this civilization, he can forge a new galactic empire. But he will avoid the mistakes of the past. He will envision a new pathway, one that sees him work with and not rule over them, at least in the beginning. For he is, and always will be, the Emperor of mankind.